McCarthyism, the Beat Generation, and also just generation gaps in general. Um, so here we go. This is the 1950s, moving into post-war era. Now the first thing is this is a picture here of just an urban city, more or less. When we take an urban, we're going to call it depreciated area, there might have been a slum or something, and we want to attract businesses and money, we call that urban renewal. So you take something that's run down and you want to run through it. A good example would be for those here from Memphis, downtown Tom Lee Park, and they're fixing it up, making the Bill Street Landing, etc., trying to make it attractable to bring in money and things like that nature. Now we do create a condition here, as you can tell here, by the bricks and the siding and the graffiti on the bottom here. This is probably a rundown neighborhood, but you can tell coming soon, new luxury condos on this site. I'm willing to bet the people who live here now will not be able to afford these condos, and so they'll be pushed out. We call this gentrification. So gentrification is basically, in short, when urban renewal takes place and the people who once lived there are forced to move because they can no longer afford it. And that's a horrible thing to happen, but it happens all the time because the name of the game is how can you make the city, how can you make a business money. All right? Now going from there, we're going to focus on the Native Americans. In the 1950s, Eisenhower and a little bit of Truman, they focused on something called the termination policy. Now, it was not the Terminator, they're going to kill them or anything. But rather, they didn't want them to practice their customs outside of their land. And so their traditions, they really went interior, and they start focusing on things. And in the 60s, it gets really kind of interesting what happens. Okay? Now, from moving there, the teenagers in the 1950s really just took things a different place. All right? And there exists in our terminology a generation gap. And that is where, in the words of Will Smith, parents and teachers just don't understand. Parents, teachers of an old generation do not understand the music or the terminology of another generation. I experienced this growing up with my mother, and now I'm experiencing it with a child of my own. And one day you too will experience a generation gap. So what caused this was the birth of rock and roll. Now, rock and roll is much like jazz. It is racially tolerant. And it was created out of something just kind of interesting, just to perchance what people did. To go and talk about the birth of rock and roll, we need to talk about Alan Freed. Alan Freed was a DJ. For those of you who don't know, that means disc jockey, not just a junkie. All right? And so he played records on the radio, and this is how he made his money. The more listeners, the more money you made. So he'd go and do research. And what he discovered is that the white teenagers were buying the R&B records of black musicians. And he thought this was interesting, especially since we're in a segregated society. And so this is what he did. He dared to be different. And on a Cleveland radio station, mainly targeting upper white middle class, he played black R&B records. And so many cities followed suit and began to do the same thing. And one of those cities was Memphis, Tennessee. And Elvis, who had been a kind of up-and-coming star at the point through gospel and other things, heard this, and he will eventually become known as the king of rock and roll. So, there you go with that, right? Now, the teenagers of this generation, they began calling them beatniks, but then later on it's mainly just shortened down to call them a beat. You've seen this when you've seen a cartoon and they go in a coffee shop and they say, man, the buzz, man, and just a weird poem, and then they start snapping. Those are supposed to be beats. Now, there are 6 things that kind of set the beats apart and make them different. Number 1 is the clothing. Okay, it's mainly black and white, etc. Number 2 here is the attitude towards smoking and just doing it out in public. That was something that was very unheard of. Drinking as well becomes a big thing. Kind of hanging out in coffee shops. That would be right here, what's going on here with the beatniks and things like that. Their music was radically different. They literally marched to the beat of their own drum. Huh? Motorcycles became a hot mode of transportation. There was a movie called Easy Rider, Black Leather Jackets. This would be the era of Grease. Grease would be beats. And finally, we have the rebel without a cause himself, James Dean, who tragically died in an accident. But I think that really personifies the era. They didn't care what happened to them. They were doing it. And lastly, writers, their own literature summed it up and did it a little different. Now, for the last two things of this one here, I'm going to focus on mainly the writers of this era. All right. The first one is a man named Jack Kerouac, and Jack Kerouac wrote a book called On the Road. Now, On the Road is about the story of Jack. I don't know if what was going on, and Jack met along this trip three people that by traditional society would be outcast, would be seen as a lowlife. They were a con man, a thief, and a prostitute. And he wrote this book, and it's got a very different feel to it. Kind of forms its own rhythm. And some readers really dislike it because it's not structured, and other readers love it because it's not structured. But in order for you to find out, you would have to go pick it up from your library and actually read it. They did make a movie. It was a horrible movie. That horrible actress from Twilight, Kristen Stewart, who has like one facial expression, she was in it, and so didn't bode well. All right. Now the other big writer I want to talk about is Allen Ginsberg. All right, and Allen Ginsberg wrote a long poem entitled "Howl," Howl, like a wolf howls at the moon. This was done to explain, why are the beats the way they are? Do they howl at the moon? Why does a wolf howl at the moon? It's just in their nature. Now we're kind of glad the beats happened, because without the beats, the hippies would have not happened. And a very young beat followed his own heart. Two of them, in fact, were Paul McCartney and John Lennon. Became friends through this mode and wrote music, and later on they'll become the Beatles with George Harrison and Ringo Starr. So you have to have a start in order to get things finished. Now in the next little section, we're going to go into the Red Scare, McCarthyism, and that's a fun topic to get into.